So 3, 2, 1. Well, Jordan, first and foremost, I'd like to thank you for taking the time out of your day to come on the show. I greatly appreciate it.
Of course. Yeah. Thank you, Armin. Yeah.
Yeah. So like we kind of decided to just do this show because you do something, pretty interesting. And, I've been kind of around combat sports all my life, but I
Mhm.
haven't necessarily like met anybody that essentially does what you do. So can you kind of tell people like what is this you're involved with?
Yeah, absolutely. So probably the big broad umbrella term that we use is HEMA. So it's an acronym, stands for Historical European Martial Arts. It's been kind of like the operative term for the attempt to revive basically dead lineages of combat systems from Europe.
Mhm.
Stretching back as far as, I mean, probably the earliest piece of material that we have is probably 14th century, but that stretches from the earliest material that we have, written material that is, to probably around World War II is kind of like the uh, kind of the arbitrary time frame that we set on that. And the reason why, I specify like the earliest stuff is probably 14th century is because it's historical, meaning like we need basically like written documentation about it. There is kind of another subset of folks that you probably could call people that are doing HEMA, that are doing things probably more along the line of experimental archaeology is kind of like the term for that. And that's more or less kind of using replicas of archaeological like remains that we have of weapons, for example, and armor to try to recreate stuff. But really the earliest written source that we have that's kind of like, hey, that gives us really any details about fighting, from a technical level
Mhm.
is a manuscript known as the Tower Armories Manuscript, and it's for sword and buckler fighting. So it's like a single-handed sword and a very small shield, basically.
I see. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the earliest one that we have. That's an actual that we can make heads or tails of. That is actually goes into some detail about how to sword fight, basically.
Why? So let me ask you this: Why do we not have anything earlier? That was there like some kind of event that took that documentation out, or people just didn't? Because you would have to think that if there was sword play or sword fighting involved in combat, that there would be training and so forth, much like we have today. So were these things just not written down? They're passed down to just like training, and nobody was reading on this kind of stuff.
Yeah, most likely, what we would think of how training, military training was done was very likely mostly word of mouth, master to master. Here's how to do it in person. Even some of our earliest material that we would probably call HEMA, where they actually started writing down these combat systems. From a variety of different sources, they echo say, hey, disclaimer, you have to learn this in person. You can't just get it from books.
Mhm.
And this is like, being able to actually see it and practice it physically. That is 100% necessary. You can't just like read the book and think that you can actually do anything. So,
Yeah, makes
yeah,
sense.
it's like, getting jujitsu techniques from YouTube, right? You have
Yeah.
to like actually get out there and start rolling and actually test this stuff out. You know,
Right. Right.
but very likely, I mean, we do have historical references to military training, like before the I-33. Yeah, 100%. Some of the earliest is it's a Latin script that was actually copied many times over the course of the Middle Ages after Rome fell. It's called De Re Militari. If I'm not a Latinist, so I'm probably
Mhm.
mispronouncing that, but
As good as I would say it.
yeah, but it's basically it doesn't go into huge detail, but it has a couple little tidbits about how to train, and it's a Roman source, by the way,
Mhm.
about how to train, Roman legionaries. Like, hey, here's a stick, here's a heavy like gladius replica or something like that, and a
Mhm.
shield, and hack away, basically. That was one of the things for like strengthening soldiers, and it goes a lot more into like tactics and things like that. But
Yeah.
yeah, that's probably one of the earlier sources that I know of, but it's not quite what we need to like make a fighting style, right? We don't have enough.
Yeah, I'm not a historian by any means, but I'm a fan of history. And as far as like the Romans, like it seems like we do have an understanding of how the legions worked. Um, but would you say it's fair to say that we kind of know it from like a more of a broader scope, as opposed to like what you're kind of talking about is more like individual like sort of hand to hand, I guess, is not, it's
Yeah.
not really hand to hand, but
Yeah, that's an important like clarification to make, because it all really depends on context. I think that our vision of acquiring individual skills to be able to like, beat anybody else up on the street, that's kind of like a modern thing, right? Like I think people were training in martial arts and sort of violence related activities for very specific reasons in the past. So, for example, I think that there's a strong tradition in Europe, at least, and I know it's the same in a lot of different other parts of the world. There's a lot of folk wrestling traditions, right? That would probably be for anybody in pretty much any time period that's like pre-modern that had lived like a rural lifestyle. I think wrestling probably would have been some sort of fixture in their sort of like folk sports traditions. So that would be kind of like everybody's baseline for their ability to basically defend themselves in a violent conflict, no matter if it's war, whether it's more of a low level type of thing, crime, things like that. But if you, it really depends on who you were, where you were, the circumstances of the time. So if you're thinking about like dueling, for example, which is receives like a lot of focus in the HEMA community, that specific context, just because it is something that we can kind of easily turn into a little bit of a sport. And the difference between whether or not what we do is a sport or a martial art, that's a huge can of worms. So we can definitely get into a little bit, but you could probably spend 2 hours just talking about that. But if you're a historical person in the time period that we're looking at, right, it's like, are you a knight? Are you somebody that that was their job, basically? That was their role in society, was to be really good at fighting and have the means and the ability to do that? Or are you somebody that it needs a couple different techniques taught to them real quick because they're going to be fighting in a potential war in 3 weeks, right?
Right.
You get called up, yeah, and
Yeah, like, that was the interesting thing about the Roman story, is because before they had professional armies, originally, when it was just becoming coming to its own, what happened was they would, and much like many of the areas operated this way, they would be farmers, and then they would just conscript whenever there's a war, like, and the farmers would just leave the land, they would go fight the war, they would come back. And so they would always start off their wars very kind of precariously, because they're still getting used to each other. But as the war went on, they would get better and better, and like the legions would become better and better. It's an interesting thing, because like I saw some of so you were just in a competition recently, like how often do these things happen, these kind of competitions?
Yeah, so HEMA as a modern phenomenon is relatively young, even though it is, we're trying to revive lineages that go back hundreds of years. Really, HEMA starts taking off with the birth of the internet. Although there were some early attempts. Actually, probably in the Victorian age, there was a couple antiquarian attempts to, pick up long swords and these medieval weapons to try to figure out how people use them back in the day. But really recently, probably the 80s and 90s is probably when we start to see people, the beginnings of the movement and the thing that we're doing now, basically modern HEMA. So that has steadily grown, I would say, since the 90s, to where probably in the last 5 to 10 years, it's really exploded, to where right before COVID, you could probably hit up a tournament every month in North America if you wanted to, a pretty
Really
sizable regional one. Yeah. But that's just if you have plenty of time and money to travel everywhere. Internationally, yeah, I mean, as you can probably imagine, there's a very lively scene in Europe as well. And that's actually where I kind of got my start. I was doing a master's degree. I was living in Oslo, Norway at the time. And I started doing this in 2013. What was kind of made me jealous is that, there's a lot of smaller countries just kind of jammed together in a smaller geographical area in Europe. And traveling around to tournaments in Europe is less of an imposition in some ways than it is in North America. So, and at the time, I think that Europe was a little bit ahead of us, ahead of North America and the United States in terms of, how intensely they were studying this basically in just numbers. But I think we've caught up to them in the last few years. But with COVID, it's complicated things. The tournament that I fought in last weekend's the first one that I had been in since 2019. So yeah, it's
So
yeah.
so what is involved in this? Because what I saw, the links that you sent me, and it was very interesting. It was sword play, right? So is it predominantly sword play that you're dealing with? Is this because I know in the past you also mentioned wrestling? Is this wrestling is separate, or is this involved in the sword play? Because some of the moves that I saw you and some of the other guys do is in close contact. There were some sweeps involved and some things like that, or at least what I would visually see as a sweep. And so, it's very interesting. It does make sense though, because right when you're fighting at anything that you're doing in a conflict combat situation, the tendency is to get closer, not farther away. So as you strike and everything, you get closer, and then grappling comes into play there. So can you kind of talk about that?
Sure. Yeah. So just to kind of rewind and back up, what we're doing in this competition is fighting with longswords. So longsword is it's a two-handed weapon basically. And when you probably look up HEMA on Google Images, you're probably going to pop up with some dudes with longswords. It's like probably the most popularly studied weapon in HEMA at the moment. And you can probably imagine why. It has a lot of romance. The two-handed sword is probably kind of ubiquitous when you think of knights. What we do in these competitions is supposed to replicate in a bit of a sporting context, dueling, one-on-one with steel longswords. Okay. So, and you could that's another huge can of worms as to, exactly what we're trying to replicate in these, because there'll be a lot of people that argue, XYZ master was, instructing you on how to fight in a deadly duel. And this doesn't really capture that context, because people aren't afraid of the weapons, right? And people are just too apt to just charge in and smash, right? But, my argument would be that sport and combat were both, when you did actual training, you basically did the sport to prepare for combat, and they tried to make those things overlap as much as possible to give you a realistic experience. I don't think that there's anybody that's a tournament fighter, I would say, in HEMA, that has too many illusions about what they're doing is not somewhat sportive. But I think that it doesn't, those two things aren't mutually exclusive. I think I hold the view that, preparing for the sport is a practice of the martial art in itself. It's practicing one facet of it. Right. So to sort of comment on where wrestling comes into all of this. So for sure, there's a huge wrestling component that's contemporaneous with the longsword sources. And there's also what they call Ring and Umschwert. So I study German sources, German language sources. I have a German language background for modern German. It's just and that's sort of like the lineage that I learned when I first got into this. So I've been my philosophy is to try to pick a couple things to excel at, and rather than to kind of be mediocre at it, 1,000 different things. Because under the umbrella of HEMA, you have everything from German longsword to Italian longsword. There's Italian language tradition for fighting that. Single-handed weapons. There's also we have a lot of sources that are dedicated to wrestling in different contexts. So some of the grappling, so in German they call it's ringen, it's still the word that they use in modern German to say wrestling. But there is a lineage of, or there are several different German language sources that I study that are just unarmed wrestling, just grappling. Basically, it looks very similar. I like to say it's like a cross between folk wrestling and judo. There's a lot of throws. It's kind of like starting at the arms. It's assumed that you're wearing a tight-fitting jacket that's basically you can grab onto. It opens up a lot of different possibilities for holds and grip fighting and things like that. So it looks very similar to judo, and it's like a judo like folk wrestling cross basically.
What would be the goal? Like what's the goal of judo is to hit the perfect, throw, the wrestling would be like pinning, those kind of things. What would be the goal in this kind of wrestling?
So there's two big ones, different like sources that I can think of that when I think of, German ringen from the Renaissance, right? So there's Ott, also known as Ott Jud or Ott the Jew, who has a manuscript that is basically, it's like that folk wrestling judo cross, but there's some nasty stuff in there too. There's like turning the head, with the palm of your hand, and it gets worse, like grabbing some of these fingers and breaking them, stomping on the feet, stuff like that. But then you see a lot of other traditional stuff like an outside sweep,
Yeah.
I would say the objective in the second one would be Fabian von Auerswald. He's a little bit later than Ott Jud, but he's much more accessible. So if you're looking for like one to look at, and if you're looking into getting into ringen, probably Fabian von Auerswald. It's got nice pictures, and it's a little bit of a later source, so it's a little bit more clearly written. But I would say the objective of that, I would argue, is for sport. It's like basically throwing the other person, gaining dominance, breaking their posture. But for probably the more serious context would be to basically gain control over your opponents, where you can do anything you want to them, whether you want to capture them or all the way up until ending their life, right? So pinning them and finishing them with a dagger or something like that.
So in a sportive scenario, would like is dominance is what's rewarded? Like, for example, I mean, like there's like in wrestling, you have points for takedown, points for, is in this kind of scenario, is that same thing? Dominance is rewarded. You're on top of your opponent. Yeah. Is there submission moves involved in this?
Well, in the source itself, we unfortunately don't have, unless I'm mistaken, they don't really go into what the rules of their sportive competitions were.
I see. Okay.
So it's more like, here's a hip throw, here's how to break their posture so that you can take their back, something like that. Here's an arm drag, like
right.
Yeah, it's not like we don't necessarily have like what their goal or objective was. I think that they were training to basically be able to throw people and pin them and all the kind of traditional folk wrestling objectives that we see. Auerswald even has a couple funny, like the closest thing I think you could probably get to that. There's something called ringen im Grüblein, which means like wrestling in a little pit. And it's like one guy has to stand with one leg in a pit and like wrestle somebody else with one arm. It's been a while since I've studied that source, so I think I'm a little bit off base on that. But basically, it's like assigning handicaps to one person and a different handicap to a different person for the amusement of everybody. He says like it's a good way to train wrestling, and also it's amusing to spectators.
That's what I was thinking when you said that. It reminded me of like when I was a kid, I used to watch WWE or WWF back then, and that would do things like that. It would be like a handicap match where like one person had his arm tied around his, around his body or something like that.
Exactly. which is like what I think a lot of people, especially beginners that are getting into HEMA, they're like, oh, I've seen Game of Thrones, and I want to be able to just like cut people's heads off and like and learn the most deadly version of the martial art. But if you look at the actual historical context of these people that are describing these things, it's it's pretty clear that the martial art that they're practicing has a variety of contexts that they're probably preparing for. I have a couple like the practice weapons here, so that like if I'm talking about one of our weapons that like
Yeah.
that's not necessarily super common or well known, I can kind of demonstrate it. So
That'd be great. Yeah.
yeah, so first of all, this is the practice sword that I fought that competition with. This is one of our training long swords. It's meant to. I wish I would have taken my sharp version out, but this is called in modern parlance. We refer to them generally as Federschwerts, like feather swords. Most likely they were not called this in history, but this is kind of like the name that's stuck in modern HEMA. But basically, it just has a reduced profile to where at the end there's not as much mass at the where you're commonly striking people with cuts. And then there's something in the back here called the schild. It's like a little flared thing. There's some argument as to what the actual utility of this is for. I think it's partly for mass redistribution so that it draws a little bit more of the mass of the blade down toward your hand. And also helps to protect your fingers. There's like this little shelf right here. How much it does, I don't know, but
what's the weight of that compared to, not just weight, but in essence it's being to like a real one? Is it very comparable or not so much?
It's probably more comparable than you think. And this is one of the big like myths, I guess, or misconceptions in popular culture about like medieval or European swords in general, is that they're super heavy. I would say that this is probably a good solid 3.8, between 3.5 and 4 pounds. I'd say it's pretty light.
That's very light. Yeah, I would think.
Yeah.
I would think, like you said, and when you start thinking about medieval weapons, you're thinking it is very heavy. Everything seems like whenever you think of European knightly weapons, my mind constantly goes to like weight. They had so much weight on them. So, but you said that is that a correct description? That one's only 4 pounds. To the real thing, is that about the same?
Yeah, and my sharp, it's in my safe. I wish I popped it out here to show, but the sharp version that I have. And so first of all, like swords could vary widely in terms of their weight, how they feel in the hand, just the length, relative length, grip length, everything like that. But I would say that for a two-handed sword, you're probably looking at between 4 and 7.5 pounds, probably in the heaviest.
So not very heavy, not as heavy as you would think.
Maybe not. I mean, it probably much lighter than you would think. Some of them probably feel a little heavy compared to the modern ones that are being cranked out of like the replicas, I mean, that are being made for modern people. But they're definitely probably a lot lighter than you would imagine if you didn't know anything about it.
As far as like training for a competition like that, and as I'm watching it, it doesn't seem like a lot of time is going by, but I can see that that it can be very exhausting. One of the matches that I saw you in, the guy like couldn't continue. I assume it was probably a large part of that was to exhaustion. How's the training for a competition like that, where you've got this armor on you and protective gear, and then you've got this sword, and you're competing against another individual who's trying to strike you in the face with a piece of metal?
Yeah, for sure. So I think it's understated how much the fencing mask actually inhibits your breathing a little bit. And that if you don't train for that, that can really screw you up. Like I would say that I didn't train hardly as much as I should for this. I was kind of a last minute entry. I was on the waiting list because they were because of COVID restrictions. They had a pretty small tournament this year, so they limited it to a pool of 20 fighters. And I was on the waiting list. I didn't really expect to be actually to fight, but I got like the call like a week and a half or 2 weeks before, and I was like, oh well, shit, I guess I'm fighting a tournament in 2 weeks. But when I am actually prepping and I know ahead of time, I'm doing a lot of like high intensity interval training. Kettlebells basically are the only things I do. I don't really do any heavyweight training. And I just try to live in that misery zone when I'm training and get just comfortable with it, because when you're in it, like, yeah, you try to make sure your breathing is as regulated as possible, but I think it's understated how tiring swinging something out in front of your body is, sustained.
Is that what you use the kettlebells for, to mimic that throwing or swinging action?
Well, I find it really helps my core strength a lot. I am careful to make any like comments on like the physics of fitness or anything like that, just because I've been wrong in the past and my assumptions have been challenged. So, I mean, I know it works for me. I can't really justify it with like fitness science or anything like that. It's just something that I like. I enjoy working out with kettlebells too. And so it makes me much more apt to pick them up.
Yeah, I did too. I've got, once COVID started, I kind of stopped going to like a regular gym and made like one out of my garage area, very small. But one of the first things that I got was kettlebells, because they're so versatile. You can do a lot with them. Yeah, and it was so like I'm watching this stuff. It's so interesting, and I see that there's particular moves that are being used. Are these moves are they developed? Because part of what's amazing is, while most combat sports and martial arts have been around for quite some time and have had a long history of no pauses, right? Like, so for example, like a lot of Japanese arts, they have no pauses. Like, they've been going and going and developing and developing. In this case, it appears like this type of combat there was a lack of understanding at some point, and then it got picked up. So you're at essentially kind of the forefront so you're developing as you're implementing, which is, interesting. These moves, are they do you develop them personally, or are you like reading material where it tells you how these moves are done?
That's a good question. So what we try to do, I mean, I'm a little bit of a source purist, I guess. Like I want to, my goal is to try to do like anything I do in competition should be able to be backed up by one of the sources that I study. So whether that's just a simple, it's called a high cut, it's just an overhand cut, an overhand right. Still, like in boxing, it would basically just be like a right cross. That's attested to, just like the low cut, right? The rising cut. So that's kind of like, I think of that and the thrusts. It's basically, you could, if you just did those simple things, you'd still be doing HEMA, right? Because it's 100% attested to by various sources. Where I start to really try to challenge myself is doing the more complex techniques that they describe. So just to get a little bit into the source that I study, the old sources, my scope is German language sources from the 15th century to the 16th century. So basically, you could kind of think of it, the two big ones that I study are, it's a guy named Johannes Listener. This is the picture, this is one of the sources for the compilation books that we use. This is, I'm not sure how well it shows up, but Johannes Listener, yeah. So he was probably a person that existed, although our attestation of him as a person is very limited. What we do have is a variety of people that claim to be of his lineage, that probably we start to see these sources emerge in the early to mid 15th century, doing what's called a gloss. So in the Middle Ages, a gloss is basically like a scholar or somebody who knows something about the subject. They'll go in and read like a primary source, like the Bible, for example, is probably the most glossed text of that time. and they would read it, and then they'd write little notes in the margins as to what the interpretation of that original source was supposed to be. So Johannes Listener, maybe this guy, we don't know if this is supposed to be Listener, but this is from one of our early manuscripts. But he composed this poem called the Zettel, and the poem is basically like we think it's like a memory or aid or like a mnemonic device for remembering the principles of his fighting system. So one of them's like traveling after, for example. It's called a concept that we call Nachreisen. It's basically like if somebody swings at you and they miss, you want to be able to follow their cut in immediately after and pop them on the top of the head, right? So they miss, and then you fade out and then pop back in, for example. Right. It's like a timing device, right? It's a thing. It's a gross concept that you can apply to a lot of different situations. There's another one that's called like the Zwerchau. It's a type of cut that you can use in a lot of different situations where you defend and attack at the same time. So if they throw an overhand right at your head, you basically cut with your short edge, take their cut on the strong of your sword, and then hit them with the tip or the tip end.
Yes.
Right? So he has a variety of these techniques that he goes over in this sort of this poem, right, in early New High German. And then the only reason that we can make heads or tails of any of this is because if you read it, you really don't know what the heck it's talking about. It's full of a bunch of like really obscure, specific fencing vocabulary. The only reason why we know or can make any sort of interpretation of this is people came after Lichtenauer that were presumably some of his students, or perhaps some of his students' that came through and they glossed the Zettel. So they went through and said, oh, here's the poem snippet, and here's like 5 or 10 paragraphs on what that means, right, in specifics. Oh, he means by this piece of the poem, oh, it means actually, you step and you throw with your short, they spell it out in prose for you. It's the only reason we can really make any heads or tails of it. And there's a ton of different techniques in that material that we can chew on and try to like pull off in tournaments and stuff like that. So it is kind of cool in that they do give you some basics to work with. But there are a lot of techniques too that the HEMA community has been working for the last 20 years trying to interpret, that we're kind of coming to the point now where there's a lot of agreed upon interpretations as to what this means, at least from the big sources. Yeah. So
I'm curious to know, what if you land a technique that's not, not considered accepted in the community? Are there like rules that you have to land only certain type of techniques, or is this something that like you take as a point of pride, like, well, I'm only using this because this is what I'm committed to learning?
It's more the latter at this point. Judging for these tournaments, and I can kind of expound a little bit on like that specific rule set and rule sets in HEMA tournaments in general in a second, but with this, like the only restrictions to what you can do are safety related. They're basically like, don't throw your sword at anybody, like don't like DDT anybody on their head. In that tournament that I fought in, I did get a couple throws, but one of our safety rules is you can't really lift anybody off the ground and slam them. You can do sweeps and stuff like in trips, but no slam. But believe it or not, that there aren't too many things that you can do with a sword that are like safe, that aren't really attested to in a lot of. Yeah,
that's what I was kind of thinking. I'd sent you that text after I saw it, and I was like, this looks a lot like kendo, even though some of the overhand strikes were similar, and I'm no kendo expert at all, but that's one of the things that, like, I don't know if you know who Dan Carlin is, but he was doing a podcast about something to do with Japan. I think it was about World War II, but he was going back to their their ability to like retain their swordsmanship throughout the modern time as well. So it's like even after like swords have stopped being used, the Japanese have developed this art of kendo that kind of keeps their structure of the way their sword, was the way they used it alive. So even to this day, they have no break in that tradition, and so I just found it interesting that like with the things that you wear is very similar, and I guess it's also similar to fencing as well. Like, how protective are these things? Because while kendo is very fast and there's a lot of hard hits, it's done with essentially a bamboo type of sword stick. You're swinging full pieces of metal at each other with appears to be similar, protective equipment. So like, how protective is it when you get hit? Do you feel it?
Oh yeah. You can get thicker or lighter jackets, and honestly, like protective equipment, it's getting better in HEMA, but you should have seen it when I first started. I mean, and that's like a typical thing that you'll hear people that have been in the HEMA community for a while. It's like, it was super backyard, like as about like 8 years ago. And then before it gets even worse. 8 years ago, like we were using like lacrosse gloves and like just normal fencing masks, and
Wow.
that's not acceptable. It was silly. Now we have a lot of dedicated manufacturers that are making HEMA specific equipment, which is super cool to see. A lot of them are located in Central Europe, but I mean, they're more and more popping up every day. Obviously, you can see like the lineage or the relation to sport fencing or Olympic fencing. We do generally, most people use like Olympic or sport fencing masks that have a little bit of a beefed up padding. Mine's like a Leon Paul, and Leon Paul is like a prolific manufacturer of sport fencing equipment. I've just put like a little bit of extra padding in it, and it's been really good. The main thing is you just don't want the mesh to be pierced. That's the main thing that's going to be a huge safety risk for you. And a lot of times you'll see that's a mask. The probably the big change is they have this, most people wear this like bib on the top. It's like a leather protector. It just absorbs a little bit of impact, and then something for the back of the head is also pretty much necessary for tournament fencing. Back of the head strikes are generally illegal.
I would imagine, yeah, and that you could really do some damage. Yeah. I mean, I guess it's also, especially if you're new to the sport, and just coming from a combat background myself, if you're new and you're not used to taking hits or taking strikes, there's a real tendency to turn your head. And so yes. I can imagine someone new coming in and getting popped in the back of the head with a sword. That would be pretty intense.
Not so great. Yeah, but like, most of the time though, we're a pretty tight-knit community. Nobody wants to hurt each other, and people that gain a reputation for wanting to hurt people are generally they don't stick around for very long. Yeah. So there's a lot of trust involved, to where I think if this thing gets larger, we probably are going to have to start being a little bit more stringent on making sure that people will have the correct safety equipment, because like I said, there's a huge diversity of manufacturers, and there's really no one standard for anything. It's more like it's at your own risk type of thing. Like
it's the Wild West.
Yeah, a little bit. I go as light as possible in my protective equipment, because like I gas out, and like if I'm gassed out, I'm going to be less able to actually make parries. That's kind of my justification. So if like, I'd rather just have the extra wherewithal to be able to protect my body. And if I get hit, like it's a bruise, it's fine. I don't want any broken bones.
Well, I was going to ask you, what's the worst thing that you've gotten? It seems like you could easily get a broken bone, just, but I don't know. Like, yeah. What's the worst injury you've gotten?
Personally, so I had 2 fluke injuries when I first started doing it. the first was due to my own stupidity, because we were doing a drill with steel where we weren't wearing masks, and we were doing something in range of each other, and I just stepped in at the wrong time, and I got like a big cut taken out like right under my eye.
And
Like
these
right on
were
my
with,
cheek.
was this with blunt swords or was this with the
Yeah,
real?
so they're blunt, but I have a tip on this one, but they have like a rolled metal tip, and
Uh-huh.
the guy I was fencing with did not have a like a protector on it, and it's kind of sharp edge right here. Like this
So you
is
could,
kind of like a safety issue, honestly. It's just why I put these on there now.
mhm.
But yeah, it just got me at the right angle and just kind of took a scoop of skin out of my cheek. Yeah, and I had to
Could
get
have took
stitches
out
for
your
that.
eye.
Yeah, that was freaky. Definitely not cool, but at least I was in Norway and it didn't cost me anything to get stitches.
Was it socialized medicine?
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, you get that with your student visa, which was kind of nice. It was nice
Yeah.
for me at the time for sure.
Awesome. Yeah.
Um,
Well, not awesome getting cut. Awesome. At
no,
least you got it, you got it taken care of. Yeah, it's interesting. Do you wear anything like on the lower half of the body, or is it just the jackets?
oh yeah, so you have like knee pads for
Mhm.
tournament fencing anyway. You want to have most of them require hard protection on your knees and shins.
Mhm. Do they have so that these tournaments they're held by individual like promoters? Is there a body that kind of oversees these things?
No, nothing that has any like binding authority, not at least in this country. It's generally put on by individual clubs,
I see.
basically out of the yeah, just out of the joy of the sport. Basically,
Mhm.
they don't really gain anything. Obviously we they generally you have a like a mat fee, like it's usually like $200 to enter a major tournament. And for those, usually most HEMA tournaments, at least before COVID, were generally a combination of competitive events and seminars as well. So some of them were just like competitions, but a lot of them just to draw people from around the country. They
Mhm.
usually have like seminars as well. So
Yeah, so you also, and I know this just from talking to you earlier, you had a class yourself, right? How like can you talk about that, like your business, like how
yeah,
how you got involved in starting it? We know how you got involved in the actual sport itself, and then just kind of go from there.
for sure. Yeah. So my club that I just started back in June, it's called Eastside Fechtverein HEMA, and Fechtverein just means in German fencing association. Uh, so I was involved with the club when I first moved back to the United States after my first club when I was living in Norway. I still, was super wanting to get in deeper and deeper into HEMA. So I moved back to Seattle, and I found a club called Lonan League. Honestly, like, that's a lot of my good HEMA friends are all still in that club. And then I was just taking classes from them for a while. And then, but the thing was with them is they didn't study the source that was like my source that I had
Mhm.
started with. So they didn't offer any like German longsword or anything like that. So I decided after doing a couple guest spots, like just coaching, when I was covering for people in the Fiore, the Italian class, that hey, it's like I want to just do my own study group. And so I started a German longsword group at Lonan as like kind of like a one of the many classes that Lonan offers there. I did that for like a good 2.5 years. I also did private lessons as well.
Mhm.
And then once COVID hit, all that dried up, all that stopped with the screeching halt. And I was just like, I always had it in the back of my mind for years, like, eventually I want to start my own club. Um, you know, once COVID hit, like, I live kind of out in the suburbs from Seattle, and just getting in and out of the city is just like it's a nightmare with traffic and everything. And so just getting there and back to Seattle was becoming kind of difficult. And like my goal, like I said, had always been to have my own gig, basically my own thing. And so I was just like, screw it, why not give it a try?
Yeah.
I've been like thinking about doing it for so long, and so I just looked up kind of like what the next steps were, and one thing has led to another, just one little step every day. And then now we're up and running, and we actually just had our first indoor class. We were like in the park for a while, just like a lot of HEMA clubs start out doing. But we had we made an awesome deal with this existing martial arts club that's indoors. And so we had our first indoor class just this Friday, and it went really well because that space is just amazing. So
what was the martial arts studio that you got into?
Yeah, it's called Universal Energy Martial Arts in Issaquah, Washington. And I'm not exactly sure what lineage he teaches. I know he's more oriented toward kids classes, but the space is just amazing. He's just a really cool guy to work with. So
what in this class, the first one that you taught, like what was what was the premise of it?
Yeah, so a typical class in my club, I have kind of a crop of new beginners. One of my good friends from college, he just he just got out of the Army. He's been kind of training with me for a few months. So he's a little bit more advanced than most of my other regulars, but we're kind of in like a beginner stage. And so we focus very heavily on body mechanics, just how to move your feet, and how to move in conjunction with throwing cuts and guiding the weapon, basically. So I see a lot of people, they'll start out with like some really complex stuff that's like taken right out of the book. And even though anything that I try to teach, I try to be able to back up with something from our sources. A lot of our sources are a little bit light on basic stuff. It's more like, oh, here's how to do like this crazy technique, as opposed to the super low percentage technique, as opposed to here's how to stand. Like here's some things to keep in mind when you're throwing basic attacks. And that's stuff that you can really only get with experience and trying to get like what we call like some frog DNA, like from other martial arts, some others that have a little bit more of those blanks filled in. And even though we have to be really careful about like making sure that we're not all of a sudden doing Filipino martial arts just with European weapons, we also have to, we really have no choice in some regards, but to like take some inspiration from other martial arts.
Yeah, I mean, position, I think, would be extremely important, especially when you're swinging the sword. I mean, you look at other like sword play, like say kendo or fencing, position is huge, is that without the proper position, it's almost impossible to succeed in a strike or a move. Even in things like judo, I mean, very rarely, if ever, you can hit a throw appropriately without being in the right position. It would be a fluke situation if that ever happened. But since in your case you don't have that material, I do see where you're saying that you do kind of need to borrow it. It's interesting that you mentioned you have to be careful that you're not just doing another martial arts. Is that a common theme or something that is like always at the forefront of your mind because there's so much out there already and so many different martial arts that are well developed? As you're progressing in yours, are you keen on making sure that doesn't happen?
Yeah, I'm not like overly paranoid about it, just because there are a lot of similarities in all martial arts, as you know. But I think that we have a good enough idea and a good enough interpretation, at least, of like these really popular sources that I study, that I'm not super afraid that it's going off the rails. I think that our interpretations honestly are improving. And as like, I think the YouTube community especially is pretty good, at least in HEMA, about, there's a lot of cool independent scholars that are like putting out a lot of stuff on HEMA on YouTube rather, that you wouldn't necessarily be exposed to if you didn't have it, right? So I think that it's really cool. Like I get a lot of inspiration from some fencers like in Eastern Europe. There's a lot of good fencers in Slovakia and Poland and Czech Republic that are doing a lot of cool stuff that I follow pretty closely. Germany as well. And there's a lot of like good fencers in the US too that I follow that it's kind of like this, especially the people that are super into the sources, that are just really into the minutia. Once you get to the point where you're like actually reading the primary source or trying to do it in the original language, and there's a nice community of like dedicated scholars that are improving interpretation still on a daily basis. So I'm not super concerned about it. I think it's actually getting better all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. I imagine the internet is huge for a community like that. That's still like in its basic stages developing.
Oh, yeah.
Without that, it'd be so difficult to, to put everything together.
Definitely. Yeah. If your listeners are like, more interested in finding out or like looking at the primary sources yourself, our main database is called weektonauer.com, WIKTENAUER.com. That is our main repository. It's hosted by this guy, Michael Chittister, who is probably like one of our foremost scholars on like HEMA, I guess, written materials. So he hosts that and updates that all the time, and it has a lot of our primary sources. Like, don't expect to be able to make heads or tails of it if you've never been to a HEMA class or you don't know, like if you don't have like the context. But if you want to see like some of the cool pictures or like see like what actual like the materials are like that we're working with, that would be a good place to go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That makes sense. So if somebody wanted to reach out to you, what would be like to kind of get, either join one of your classes or something like that? Like how would they do that?
Yeah, so our website is eastsidehema.com. It is a work in progress, so don't judge me too bad on the website, how it looks right now. But my email address is also eastsidefv, like Foxtrot Victor, at gmail.com. So
Awesome.
yeah, I'd be happy to take any inquiries. Anybody that's in the area that wants to train with us, we're definitely accepting students. So
Yeah. How easy would it be to teach something like that online, like virtually?
I think with COVID, a lot of HEMA instructors have attempted it. I think it would be very difficult. I've entertained the idea briefly, but I don't have the space personally. Like I don't have a nice wide space. I have a pretty
Yeah.
small like duplex here. I don't really have a dedicated place that's out of the rain that I could film stuff and like
Mhm.
have classes like that. So
Yeah.
that's kind of an issue for me, but a lot of instructors are doing it. And yeah, I don't know how. I've never been a student and tried to learn it, but I can't imagine trying to do it.
Yeah, it's tough. It's kind of like when we talked about maybe doing jujitsu like online. It's like they can kind of show you like but without actually doing it, it's so difficult, and hands-on is
Right.
the best way to learn. How is sparring, how important is sparring to this? Like could you learn, could you be proficient in doing it like independently, or is sparring an absolute necessity?
Well, my opinion is you got to spar at some point to see to have the context that your brain filters what you read it through properly,
Yeah.
basically. So like there are a lot of people, and this is also a big controversy in the human community as to whether putting on gear and going full speed is actually productive. And there is a camp that says that the more protective equipment you put on, the farther away you're getting from the context of that of the martial art.
Mhm.
And then the way that they go about things is, kind of, and I don't want to like, speak for anybody else, but what I see is they're going very slow with no protective equipment and basically going at a speed that is safe.
Yeah.
For
It's interesting that they would say that that takes away from the martial, because just in my mind, and again, I'm not a practitioner of this, but I would think that because most of these were fought with armor, right? Correct? I mean, or am I mistaken?
they're different contexts. So like there's a YouTuber, Matt Easton. He's like a huge sword YouTuber, and that's one of the memes that comes out of his YouTube channels. Like everything's about context. But so I'm kind of sounding like him right now. But yeah, so for Lichtenauer longsword, like what I teach primarily, it's generally meant that it's assumed that it's totally unarmored,
Oh, I
maybe
see.
with
Okay.
like leather gloves, but nothing substantial like plate armor or mail or anything like that. There are dedicated sources for fencing and armor that have a whole different host of techniques and strategies, because for the most part, if you're wearing a full plate harness, is like what you think of when you're looking at like a high medieval or like Renaissance era knight, is you're not going to cut through any part of that generally with
Yeah.
with an edge of a sword. The general like idea is to attack the armor's weaknesses with the like points with tips, like either with a dagger tip, with a spear tip, or with the tip of a sword, or to wrestle that person to the ground, get on top of them almost like jiu-jitsu style, and pin them to where you can put a dagger in a weak part of their armor.
Got it. Good.
Um,
So the style that you're doing in the times that it was used was done without armor, correct? That's what you're saying. Okay.
exactly. Yeah. And that is, so that I guess I would call them the anti tournament crowd in HEMA. They would probably say that putting on the protective equipment that we do and going full speed is actually creating bad habits, because people aren't they're not respectful enough of the weapon to be
Sure.
to where they're making choices they otherwise wouldn't.
Right.
My contention is how can you really discover as to what works at full speed or not if you're not trying it
Yeah.
out?
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, everything's a little bit of a compromise. Like, I think that you should approach your training from multiple different angles. Yeah, you should slow spar with no equipment every once in a while. Yeah, you should spar with all of your equipment fast. You should use different simulators. You should have different types of drills. I'm a really big fan of sparring, like goal oriented sparring. Like, hey, I want you to try to, you guys are going to go free play basically, but I want you to only cuts count for you. Okay. And then for you, only thrusts count. Or like, I want you to like try to land this,
Yeah.
and then only that count. Like those are, I think, some of the most productive pieces, like forms of training for me. And there are people that are on the other end of the spectrum that say like, oh, like I don't care about this. I mean, I don't know any of them, but they're like, I don't care about the sources. I just want to like, do something that's like akin to Battle of Nations and just kind of go in there and smash. But
Yeah. That's, well, I mean, that, yeah, see, that point that you're talking about only this counts, only that counts, that's very similar to like the way somebody would approach like Muay Thai, where we're like, okay, well, we're just drilling, like knees today, or we're just drilling like low kick to fine tune a particular skill, which makes complete sense. As far as like the full speed versus non-full speed, I don't like, it doesn't make sense that you wouldn't go full speed, because if you don't, I mean, yes, that aspect of the fear of death is, I guess, a big motivator, that you don't have. But if you're not going full speed, then how, like you said, how can you ever determine whether something works in full speed? That's one of the things that people always talk about, grappling arts as opposed to striking arts, how people that tend to grapple do better. Like they're, in the sense of, they have a more fully like developed way of defending themselves or using it, because they're constantly going at full speed, like jiu-jitsu, judo, and wrestling. Whenever you're training in those, most of the time, unless you're just doing drills, in sparring, you're going 100%, because there's no fear of getting seriously hurt. While striking arts, like boxing, let's just take boxing for example, like you can't go full speed every time with that. So it's like, so you lose something there. So yeah, I do believe that the people that are doing just these movements, it almost becomes more of like an art form. So it's more of the art part of martial arts than it would be the martial part. I would say,
Yeah, I mean, like I think that you should, if you're trying, it depends on what your goals are personally.
Right,
Like
right.
if you have seen Game of Thrones a couple times, and I'm not trying to like denigrate anybody that's in this camp, obviously. It's,
Mhm.
if you're into like the culture part, like you really just want to swing a sword for exercise and you're
Mhm.
not interested in taking the risks that might lead you to getting hurt, then I'm not going to push you to spar if you
Right,
don't want to. If
right.
you want to drill and like kind of learn it from that angle, that's cool. Like if that's what your goal is in this, like I'm not going to push you to do something you don't want to do. But if you're looking at being a more well-rounded and skilled martial artist, I think that it's a necessary thing that you have to do
Yeah.
to get there, to have that full understanding of like, oh, okay, this is what it kind of feels like when someone's giving me a lot of pressure.
Right.
And if my whole game collapses when somebody gives me pressure, then I got problems.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's the same kind of questions that were asked at the early stages of like other martial arts, because and you still kind of have that now. Like you'll have like karate, for example. You have people that are just do like point karate, right? Like where you're just
Yeah.
touching people, and there's a community that's like, why are we doing this? It's like this is not going to help you with like with an actual attack, like where someone is really trying to hurt you. You're not just going to
Mhm.
be touching them. So it's kind of like that conversation. I don't know if there's ever going to be like a real resolution. I think once this starts getting bigger and bigger, and then there's like binding associations that are developed, which is probably going to happen at some point as it grows. They're going to determine these things for those associations, but it's going to be
Possibly.
tough.
Yeah. But just since the HEMA community grew up online and it's enjoyed this, and it's benefited a lot from this kind of individualistic attitude of like everybody can kind of study anything under the HEMA banner, like what qualifies as it. I think that there's some sort of institutional resistance to that, and I'm kind of in agreement with that. Like I kind of fear it getting too regulated to the point where there's one authoritative body that says, oh, this is like how competition should be run, this is how everything should look.
Yeah.
I almost don't want that. Like I think it's great how it is right now.
Yeah. It's funny. I was listening to this other podcast, and somebody posed the question, and the guy, and I forgot what the question was, but the guy said, if you love your martial arts, you don't want it in the Olympics. And and what he meant by that, which I didn't really understand, but once you get into like an Olympics, and to your point, associations in general, right, that are like decide rules. Jiu-jitsu has this problem right now with their different associations. It's like they change the sport. So like, for example, like judo in its original state pre-Olympics, you could attack the lower half of the body. Now, like since it got into the Olympics, they deemed it, from their point of view, they didn't want to, like, I think it was a safety concern, but well, at least that's the way they made the decision upon that basis. So now judo only attacks the upper body. You don't see any like double leg takedowns in judo or anything like that. It's always upper body type of throws. So to your point, yeah, if there are associations, there will be rule changes. There will be like a standard that they set, and if you don't fall within that standard, you're going to kind of fall to the wayside, so to speak. So.
Yeah, 100%. And that kind of brings up, a difference in rule sets that is common in my region as opposed to without. So, for longsword tournaments, we have been practicing and developing this continuous fencing rule set, at least at Lonan, since we started this. Our regional event started in 2016. They started calling it Sword Squatch. It's pretty awesome. But I think the first sword squatch we did what was called the Long Point rule set. And Long Point is another very large regional event. It's over in Maryland on the East Coast. And it's probably, I would say, I think it was probably the largest HEMA tournament for a while, a few years running. But their rule set was basically, it's almost like in football when a play happens and they stop time. So basically, they'll put some time on the clock, they'll say fight, and then once a solid hit is scored, the judge will say stop, and then they'll separate. They'll ask the judges with semaphore flags, like, hey, what did you see? You raise a red flag for the red fighter, and like for which equals how many points you thought they got based on the rule set. And then they register the points, and then you fight, and they start and stop time every time they start and stop. Whereas with continuous fencing, it's 45-second rounds per match. And the only reason that they would stop is for a safety concern. So whether if people are just sitting in range and just beating the crap out of each other with no defense, like attempts to defense, a lot of times they'll separate them. If it's like people are like in grappling and they're just fidgeting around and they're not doing anything for a while, they'll separate. Somebody gets a ring out, they'll separate. Those are really the only reasons that they would. Otherwise, it's kind of scored on a continuous basis, like kind of like boxing in a way.
Yeah. What do you prefer?
I like diversity in rule sets. Like, I think I like both versions for different reasons. I think continuous fencing is cool and I think it promotes cleaner fencing because you can't just smash into the person and try to just like reach for points, because you have a lot more time and space afterwards that you have to think about your defense. Like you can't stop time by hitting them first necessarily as easily. The downside to that is it is tiring. It is very tiring. And like I wasn't in particularly great shape before this tournament, and I was dying by the end. I was not having a good time.
Exhaustion is the worst in any kind of like combat situation or a sport. Exhaustion is the biggest fear. I think most people think that losing is a competitor's biggest fear. It's exhaustion, because the last thing you want is be exhausted and can't defend yourself. That's a terrible place to be in. Yeah,
it really is. And it's like I was thinking, I felt gassed even before I started fighting because I was nervous. And like they made us wear surgical masks, right, because of Washington state COVID restrictions. And that just like I felt like I was drowning, man. Like it was really, because your adrenaline's already going and you're already sort of taxing your respiratory system a little bit, and then once the friggin' fencing mask goes down, oh man.
So you had you had a surgical mask and the fencing mask over it. That's tough. That's like, exercising with a mask on it's very difficult.
It's tough, man. And the only way to get better at that is to train that way.
You got to train for what you're going to do. Sometimes I think people make a mistake, especially like in combat sports, is they'll train really hard, but they won't necessarily train in what they're actually doing. Like they'll go running, and that's great. Running is great. All that stuff is good for like strength and conditioning, but it's like you kind of have to do like what you're going to be doing in that live situation. Otherwise it's just going to be too difficult, to jump into it without doing it prior,
100%.
So it's funny that you mentioned about promoting cleaner fencing with the continuous style, because I remember when I was a kid and I took Taekwondo, and they had a little tournament with like a staff tournament type of thing, and the staff had like padding on both ends, like big huge padding, so it wasn't like there was no issue of safety or anything like that. But I was a kid going up against grown men, and I literally beat this guy by just lunging my staff at his foot, like over and over. It was the most ridiculous thing, and he was actually trying to do techniques, and all I did was just lunge my staff at it. It is ridiculous. I know that's the rule set, but it's like if that's all you have to do to win, it's kind of like,
Yeah,
well, what are you really doing,
I know. Yeah, which is why it's important to keep in mind what your objective is when you're fighting in a tournament. Is it to get clout in the HEMA community? Like, is it to have like a piece of metal to hang on your wall?
Right,
Or
right,
is it to test your techniques like against
right.
uncooperative new faces,
Yeah.
basically?
Well, I think for
Yeah.
you, it definitely, I would assume that you feel the same way, as to test your techniques, especially since you're now in the realm of teaching, and you have your own, your own students and your own business where you're teaching people. To testing your techniques is extremely important,
Yeah.
because I mean, what's the point if they don't work, right?
I know. And it makes a world of difference when you're actually teaching your students, when you're like, okay, like I can tell you from straight experience from like a thing that I fought on Saturday, like, here's what you need to do. Like, you need to close
Mhm.
the line. You need to make sure that you're making a threat to your opponent. You have to make sure that these things are in place, or I can tell you from experience, this is not going to work.
Right,
Like,
right.
it just having the confidence that backs that up is as an instructor is really important. And yeah, there are some instructors, and I think as a student too, it's important to know what your instructor's background is and make sure that lines up with your own goals too.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
I focus on competitive HEMA. Like, that's one of my big focuses, and I'm in that space a lot. And so that colors a lot of my interpretations, right?
Mhm.
I try to stay as disciplined as I can about staying true to the sources, which is why I'm always reading through them. But there are some instructors out there that tournaments are not their focus,
Yeah,
and they're going to give you a little bit of a different experience as a student. So
yeah.
in any martial art too, that's I would say that holds true.
That is, yeah, that is there. Those two realms exist in any, combat sport or martial arts, where you have those who, and we touched on it a few minutes ago, those who basically are just for, the schools that are just about the patterns, and then there's
Mhm.
schools that are just about the competitions, and there's always like
Sure.
that diametrically opposed, like, systems, so to speak.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I try to give something that basically gives something of value to anybody that walks in the door and wants to try our class out. But I make no bones about it that, I'm definitely want to get people into more dynamic drilling as soon
Mhm.
as possible based on, the gear that we have.
Yeah,
So
yeah. Awesome.
yeah, I got some like these foam boffer things that are in the mail because none of my new people have any like protective gear yet.
Hmm.
And it's a really great entry level way, and it's fun.
What
it's
what are they? Can
packaging, but
you can you
yeah,
explain that again?
they're like they're longsword simulators, but they're basically the blade is just like boffer foam. It's just foam.
Oh wow. Okay. So
Yeah.
yeah. So, well, give us a good way that they can actually, like, hit and not have to worry about,
Mhm.
injuring anybody.
It's surprising how reluctant people are to hit each other in the face. Like, they're very, very conditioned to not do that.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
yeah.
That was one guy I was listening to years ago, and he was talking about, like, just combat sports, and like how some people, like, worry about getting hit in the face, and he was thinking about, like, I don't want to hit somebody in the face, I have a reluctance to strike somebody, which is, I mean, understandable. It's probably a good thing in normal circumstances, but yeah, but that is something that, like, is more common than people would think. So
It really is. Yeah.
everyone thinks that, oh, I can do it, I'll just get in there and do it, and it's like, there's a, like, internal reluctance to strike somebody. So
100%.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. Well, hey, Jordan, I think we did like about an hour, maybe in 15 minutes, hour and 20
Oh, nice.
minutes. So yeah, I appreciate you coming on. So you already said the website, that is
Yeah.
that primarily the way to reach you, is.
Yeah, you can look us up on Facebook as well.
Mhm.
I'm pretty active. I check my email inbox. It's eastsidefv@gmail.com, or you can go to eastsidehema.com, or you can look up Eastside Feshverein on Facebook as well.
Awesome. And I'll link everything down below, so it'll be easier for people to come in contact with you. And again, I appreciate your time. It's super interesting, and I wish you the best with all this.
Thanks so much, Armin. Yeah, have a good rest of your day.
Take care. Bye.